of weapons. Now, clearly, some Palestinians do manage to get weapons. We hear about it in the media, but the vast majority of Palestinians don't. They don't have anything to defend themselves with besides stones or their bodies. Meanwhile, Israeli soldiers and civilians, these settlers, are oftentimes carrying around these large weapons. So that's the kind of balance of power that you feel going into the territories. The settlers have burned the village generator so that the Yanun villagers didn't have any more electricity. And this is the Yanun water source where settlers have come down, they've urinated in the water source, they've poisoned it with dead chickens, anything to try to make the villagers leave. And at the end of 2002, the village of Yanun came together to make a decision about this issue. And what they decided was that they were going to leave. They decided to abandon their ancestral homes and land because they felt so threatened by this settler presence. And one day they picked up and left. All 300 of them. Well, the international and Israeli peace communities heard about what had happened in Yanun and went to the villagers staying in a nearby town with an offer. And what we said was, if you choose to return to your homes and your land, we will commit to maintaining a constant presence of international and Israeli peace activists to live with you in your community for as long as you want us there. We will bear witness to these crimes. We will document them, try to get them into the media. We will stand beside you in solidarity should those settlers attack. And about a third of the villagers accepted our offer and have come back to their homes, almost up 100 of them. And living along with them now are these international and Israeli peace activists. And this is a picture of one of those activists. His name's David. He's a friend of mine. And David was actually the victim of a particularly brutal settler attack in which he was beaten to a pulp in his face, which shows that the settlers will attack not only Palestinians, but internationals and Israelis who are there in solidarity with those farmers. But David continues to do wonderful work in the Palestinian territories. He's recovering, and he is a citizen of Israel, a Jewish Israeli, and one of many Israeli activists that I've had the privilege to work with in Palestine. Now, it's very important for people to distinguish between what it means to be Jewish, someone from the Jewish religion or culture, like myself, what it means to be Israeli, a citizen of the state of Israel, and what it means to be a Zionist, someone who supports the idea of an exclusively Jewish state. These are three separate categories. There is some overlap, but they are not the same thing. It's very important to distinguish. There are Jewish people who are not Israeli, like myself. There are Israelis who are not Jewish. 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian. There are Jews who are not Zionists. There are Zionists who are not Jewish. The increasingly influential Christian Zionist movement in this country. And it's very dangerous when these ideas become conflated because people start associating them as equal, such that people are afraid of standing up against what Israel's doing because they're afraid that would make them an anti-Semite or a Nazi or something. And it's absurd. It's crazy. You know, occupation and oppression have nothing to do with Judaism. And to criticize these things is not anti-Semitic. So it's important to keep these things separate in our minds. Here you can see a Jewish Israeli, a rabbi from a group called Rabbis for Human Rights, planting an olive tree alongside a Palestinian farmer. Here you can see an Israeli activist protesting the policies of her government alongside Palestinian colleagues in the resistance. In Israel, all Jewish men and women are required to serve in the military, but there have been thousands of Israelis that have stood up and said, we refuse to take part in this institution, and they're known as the refuseniks. And I have to say that in Israel, there's a much higher tolerance for debate and dissent on this issue than you find in the United States. In Israeli newspapers, you'll find much more candid descriptions of the occupation than in U.S. mainstream newspapers, where sometimes it's even taboo to use the word occupation. But in Israel, actually, the majority of the people are opposed to the settlements and opposed to the occupation as it is right now. So a lot of times, people in the United States feel like they have to support the Israeli government in order to support the Jewish people or the Israeli people. And they don't realize that just like in the United States, there are Americans that don't always support what part of their government may do. There are there are Israeli citizens that don't support the Israeli government. And actually, a very telling statistic shows that that it is 5 times more likely for an Israeli soldier to commit suicide than to be killed in a terrorist attack. And so when people talk about this occupation as helping the Jewish people, they don't realize how many Israelis are actually against it and how important it is for the Jewish people as well as the Palestinian people to end this. Refuseniks often suffer from discrimination within their own communities. I've known refuseniks that have been ostracized by their communities, even disinherited by their families, refuseniks that have gone to jail for what they believe, and refuseniks are ineligible for a number of jobs in Israel. So there's a whole slew of institutions built up to prevent Israelis from speaking out against what their government is doing. And yet they continue. Here's a Palestinian farmer picking olives with an Israeli activist in the olive harvest. I'd like to bring us back to the main outline. We've talked about restricted movement, we've talked about settlements and outposts, and down at the bottom there we've talked about Israeli activism. And I'd like to begin now talking about the wall before getting into imprisonment and, of course, resistance. So, the wall. This is a picture of the wall that Israel's building. That's me and a friend standing in front of it. And this is what it looks like in urban areas. It's 25-foot concrete. And oftentimes in the newspapers you'll find it's not called a wall. Instead they call it a security fence. And a lot of people really believe that this is a security means. It's to prevent terrorism. And I've talked to people who say, well, look, it's very sad to have a wall and everything, but we've been fighting for so long, and all we want is peace. And maybe if we just stick up a wall between the two sides, they'll stop fighting each other. They'll stop killing each other. Well, this is an interesting question, right? Does separation, does segregation bring peace? Also interesting is that a lot of the people that support the wall, it turns out, if you ask them, may not have ever actually seen a map of where the wall is being built. And this is really critical to understanding the intention behind and what the effects are actually going to be of this wall. So, if you were going to build a wall between your house and your neighbor's house, where would you build it? Along the property line, right? Or maybe a little bit on your territory. Well, take a look at where Israel is building this wall. In this map, you can see the border around the West Bank, and then you can see those red lines that indicate where Israel is constructing this wall. As you can see, over 80% of it doesn't even touch the green line, that border of the West Bank, but actually snakes in effect annexing all of that land on the western side onto the Israeli side. In particular, take a look at the Jerusalem area, where most of the land is being taken. And remember, of course, that Jerusalem is a holy city not only for Jewish people, but also for Muslims and for Christians. 20% of the Palestinian population is Christian. And they, along with their Muslim counterparts, are being separated from the religious center of their land, as well as the economic center of their land and the geographic center of their land. The entire eastern third of the West Bank was going to be cut off with the wall, and now instead of building a wall, they've decided to line that eastern third with checkpoints so that Palestinians, for the most part, can't even access that part of the West Bank. So what's happened is that it's been chopped up. The West Bank has been chopped up into little sections. And here is a series of 4 maps that really show over time what has happened. And I think that they really tell the story well. The first map represents, with the green, the amount of land that was owned by Palestinians in 1946, and that's 92% of the land, whereas Jews owned 8% of the land. Then in 1947, the UN Resolution 181 offered Jews 54% of the land and Palestinians 46% of the land. By the end of the 1948 war, when Israel was declared a state, the Jewish Zionist forces had actually acquired 78% of the land, leaving the Palestinians with 22% of the land in the West Bank and Gaza. And finally now, in 2006, you can see what that land has come to. a series of smaller sort of enclaves and islands. Here you can see the region that I was living in, and the way that Palestinian territory has been sort of chopped up and compartmentalized by that wall. In particular, at the top left is the city of Qalqilia, a city of more than 50,000 Palestinians that has been completely surrounded by this 25-foot concrete wall, such that its outskirts look something like this now. These are the sniper towers, razor wire, and concrete wall around the Qalqilia city, also known as the Qalqilia ghetto now, or an open-air prison even. And very interesting is as a person of privilege in this part of the world, as an American, as a Jewish person, as a white person, I was actually able to see this wall from both sides of it. So here are photographs of the Qalqilia wall from the city of Qalqilia, the Palestinian side. Meanwhile, the next photograph I'm going to show you is a picture of this exact same wall from the Israeli highway that passes by on the other side of it. And I think this is very interesting. They've sort of built up on a slant up to the wall where they plant flowers in the springtime, such that it doesn't even look like a wall. And as I said before, many Israelis are much better informed about the situation than American Jews or Americans in general in this country. And yet at some point, I actually think that most Israelis probably don't even know what the wall looks like, where it's being built, what it's doing to Palestinian farmers and families. And this, to me, is almost a kind of censorship, preventing that message from getting across. And of course, censorship is something happening in our country as well. Here's a little anecdote. A friend of mine was flying back from Palestine to the United States, and she had a layover in Germany along the way where she picked up this issue of International Newsweek because it had a particularly sympathetic article about the plight of the Palestinians. You can see at the top there. And then she had another layover in Chicago on her flight home where she found this. Also Newsweek, August 2004, but the US version, with almost the same information, but one major difference. That article about the plight of the Palestinians had been completely removed from the entire magazine and replaced by one about the Olympics. And, well, some people will tell you that's just because Americans don't care about the Middle East, but you know, look at the cover story. Of course Americans care about the Middle East. We read about what's happening in Iraq. We read about what's happened in Lebanon. This is a kind of censorship, and it's happening all over the place. We need to be aware of it. It's very dangerous, of course, because the very people who are paying for what's happening don't know what's happening. And so, you know, you don't have to take my word for it. I tell people, do your own research. You know, I didn't believe it when I first heard it. I did my own research, and that's what I recommend for other people to do. Now, another kind of censorship is just also in the wording. So, for example, instead of calling it a wall, calling it a fence. And, well, to be fair, in rural parts of Palestine, the wall looks like this. At its base is wire fence. But if you look a little bit closer, you'd find that this fence is not the kind of fence that you'd have like in your backyard kind of fence. Much of it is reinforced with heavy-duty electric wire and almost everywhere with razor wire. Back to the concrete areas. This is Abu Dis, a neighborhood of East Jerusalem. And what I want to illustrate here is that when you have a Palestinian built-up area and an Israeli settlement in the Palestinian territories, the wall won't be built, first of all, along the actual border, or even right in between the Palestinian town or village and the nearest settlement, or even sort of right up against the settlement to just get it onto the Israeli side. But oftentimes, in my experience, they'll build the wall as close as possible to the Palestinian built-up area so that not only the settlement, but all the land between the settlement and the nearest Palestinian town or village also ends up on the Israeli side. And this land, you know, it's not just pretty land to have a picnic on once in a while. This land is